Hello, my name is Brooke Knight and welcome to my presentation. The purpose of this is to demonstrate a revised unit of work which includes Indigenous content, perspectives, approaches and Indigenous teaching strategies. The unit plan I will be deconstructing and adapting will be one designed specifically for a Year 11 English class at Smithfield State High School. Smithfield is a secondary school located on the northern beaches of Cairns. Current data reflects that of the 1,000 students, 10% are Indigenous. In terms of geographic location, Smithfield is situated between the Great Barrier Reef and Rainforest National Parks. Both these locations hold historical significance for the local Aboriginal people and the students alike. To further its ties to culture, Smithfield is only kilometres from the local Indigenous cultural park, Jabberkai, and is in close proximity to the Aboriginal community of Yarrabah. Quite evidently, Smithfield's location means it and its students are surrounded by and engulfed in rich connection to culture. For this reason, the learning needs of the students must respond to and be inclusive of the local students' culture, values and identity. Changes to my unit plan have been further informed by the requirements of the Australian curriculum and the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers. ACARA acknowledges the need for the Australian curriculum to provide every opportunity possible to close the gap. For this reason, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and culture cross-curriculum priority has been designed so that students are able to see themselves, their identities and their cultures reflected in the curriculum and as a result feel respected and valued. In the English curriculum, ACARA recommends that students develop an awareness and appreciation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander literature. This includes storytelling traditions and contemporary literature. These recommendations have been heavily reflected through my unit. Both storytelling and the use of Australian and Torres Strait Islander literature are now included in the unit, and students are required to examine the impact of social, historical and cultural contexts. Lastly, the APST Standard 1.4 requires teachers to implement strategies for teaching Indigenous students. I have since included a number of these specific strategies that will be explored later in this presentation. Tyson Yunkaporta's 8 Ways Learning Framework that he developed in 2009 has had the biggest influence on the changes made to my unit plan to be more inclusive of my Indigenous students. The framework outlines pedagogies that have been designed to respond to the learning needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, who often find themselves marginalised in a classroom that responds only to the learning needs of non-Indigenous students. It allows teachers to include Aboriginal perspectives by using Aboriginal learning techniques. According to Yunkaporta, teaching through Aboriginal processes and protocols, not just Aboriginal content. The framework explores ways of learning that have been heavily implemented into my unit plan and will be explored later in this presentation. The original unit had very little consideration in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives and teaching strategies. To its credit, the unit had already implemented one form of Indigenous content through the exploration of the film and novel The Rabbit-Proof Fence. Despite this form of content, the unit was incredibly lacking in terms of Indigenous perspectives and teaching strategies. For this reason, I have embedded many forms of perspectives and researched the most effective ways to teach Indigenous students and adapted the unit plan accordingly to ensure they have the most effective and successful learning experiences possible. The only form of Indigenous content was in the form of The Rabbit-Proof Fence, both a film and novel that reflects the true events of the stolen generation. While this is a meaningful form of Indigenous content, I have added more throughout the unit in terms of novels and poems to enhance the students' understanding of Indigenous culture, values, beliefs and history. In order for Indigenous students to feel welcome and important, it is vital that they see their culture valued through having it implemented into mainstream classroom content. In the English subject particularly, Indigenous content can be embedded through the use of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander text. My original unit plan already utilised The Rabbit-Proof Fence, a film and novel alike that portrays Aboriginal people heavily. To strengthen the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander portrayal in my classroom, I further included a number of Indigenous texts. These include poems by Aboriginal authors and videos presented by Indigenous people. I have also embedded a number of Indigenous perspectives into my unit. These perspectives reflect individual and community experiences, cultural beliefs and values. They acknowledge and connect Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples' ways of knowing, viewing and relating to the world. In order to most accurately portray these perspectives, there are a number of occasions where I would seek to invite community members to give a more effective and meaningful interpretation of Indigenous culture and events. Based on feedback provided from my first unit plan, I will consider alternative resources where it is not possible to invite a local community member. Indigenous resources will be utilised to fill the void given they are meaningful, respectful and informative. Tyson Yunkaporta's framework heavily influenced the new teaching strategies I implemented into the unit plan. Prior to exploring this framework, teaching strategies that appealed to the learning needs of Indigenous students were not considered. I added a number of these strategies into my unit plan to play to the strengths of my students. These include using visual learning, yarning circles, group work, the deconstruct-reconstruct pedagogy, and no language learning methods. All these strategies have been recognised as being beneficial for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students alike. I will make modifications to week 1 of my unit plan by placing more emphasis on the Indigenous topics we are about to explore. I'll begin this by including a welcome to country. According to the North Queensland Land Council, the best practice is to invite an elder from the traditional owner group to welcome the students to country. In the case of Smithfield, it would be a member of the Jabberginji tribe. This demonstrates my commitment as a teacher to the principles of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Further, according to the NQLC, if it's not possible to invite a traditional owner representative to the class, the best practice involves using a script provided from their website. In terms of Week 1's activities, students will watch and explore the rabbit-proof fence, which embeds Australian and Torres Strait Islander content in itself. Beginning by watching the film rather than reading the novel appeals to the learning styles of Indigenous students who learn best from visual cues rather than reading directly, according to Corf and Yunka Porter. Students will also engage in class discussion on whether they can relate to any of the experiences or emotions had by the characters in the film. In Week 2, students continue to focus on Indigenous text by investigating the relationship between the writer and the audience. To do this, students will investigate the way characters are being constructed. I added the use of graphic organisers for students to use when deconstructing the characters. This aligns with Yunka Porter's learning maps pedagogy, where visuals are used to map out processes and content for learners to follow. To embed Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous elders are invited into the classroom to assist the students in understanding the events of the Stolen Generation and Rabbit-Proof Fence. This will be done by utilising Yunka Porter's storytelling pedagogy, where Indigenous students and elders are able to connect through the stories they share. As well as this, an excursion will be organised at the local Japakai Centre, so students are able to further immerse themselves in the culture and develop a deeper understanding of culture from an Indigenous perspective. I've adapted Weeks 3, 4 and 5 to be more inclusive of Indigenous students as they analyse perspectives and representations of concepts, identities, times and places in text. Throughout these weeks, students explore many more Aboriginal texts such as poems and novels written by Aboriginal authors on Aboriginal topics. A number of teaching strategies based on Yunka Porter's framework have also been utilised. This includes yarning circles, group work assisted by community members. If community members are not able to attend, students will be shown videos of people of colour, such as Barack Obama, debunking the notion of acting white. This is in relation to the Aboriginal poem, Always Told I Was a White Girl. This will stimulate discussion on Indigenous perspectives before students can take part in their yarning circles independently. Furthermore, by working in groups to explore the meanings behind the poems, the learning needs of Indigenous students will be catered to. Corf have recognised that Aboriginal students are more used to working for their collective good rather than focusing on individual achievement, and therefore benefit heavily from working in groups rather than as individuals. By adding community members to these groups, the learning experiences of students will only be strengthened as Indigenous perspectives are embedded. Indigenous teaching strategies have been heavily implemented in Week 6 to 9 section to ensure Indigenous students in the class are best equipped to complete the assignment. Students will partake in an art and drawing-based lesson to portray the emotions of characters in the Rabbit-Proof Fence, a pedagogy recommended by Yunka Porter. The deconstruct-reconstruct pedagogy will be adopted when teaching students how to construct their own multimodal presentation. As a teacher, I can deconstruct an exemplar of a multimodal presentation so the students are aware of how they must reconstruct it. The no language learning method is inspired by observations of Indigenous people and the way they learn. It takes away the language element, which as a result can also take away the confusion of being exposed to too many words. The teacher can use this pedagogy through using hand signals but no language to signify when they are using specific components of the genre, such as cohesive devices. Further adaptations have been made to the unit in terms of the assessment task provided. Changes have been made to the original assessment task in order to be more culturally inclusive of Indigenous students and play to their strengths to give them the best chance of success. Given a number of recommendations by the ACA, I will now give students a choice of presenting their assessment task in a multimodal presentation rather than just a written task. This plays to the strengths of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, who are able to better grasp and therefore explain concepts that are presented visually. Furthermore, assessment tasks that are not required to be performed in test-like conditions further play to the strengths of these students. I have also redesigned my assessment task sheet as to simplify any language barriers that may exist for Indigenous students and provide definitions for subject-specific terminology.